You don't know your way. Mrs. Tibblethwaite found him in a bed. He hid in the cupboard, you see. Her voice trailed away. The story sounded so unreal. He could hardly believe it himself. Mrs. Ellis carried on. He put the cups and saucers in the washing machine, drank gravy by the boatful, and stuck the soap on his helmet. So we put him in a rowing boat, and now he's rowing back to Denmark. By himself? Asked Mrs. Tibblethwaite in surprise. Really, Mr. Ellis, I'm rather shocked. It wasn't an advertisement then, interrupted Mrs. Johnson. No, he was a real Viking, but we can't see him because he's rowing to Denmark. Yes. And you expect us to believe all that? Mr. Johnson sat and grinned at them all. Come on, you're joking. It's a pretty good joke too. Mrs. Tibblethwaite grunted and drew himself upright. It's no joke, Mr. Johnson. I believe it because I know it to be true, and I expect you to believe it too. I've been staying at this hotel for a week, and so has Sigurd. I know him very well. Mrs. Johnson stiffed a giggle. Oh, I see, Mr. Sigurd is your husband. Of course he isn't. But he was in your bed, Mr. Johnson added. Yes, no, yes. Look, you're calling me a liar? Demanded Mrs. Tibblethwaite angrily. No, replied Mr. Johnson, but you might be a nutcase. Surely you don't really think this character is a real Viking? Mrs. Tibblethwaite sat down in despair. Mr. Ellis started to say that obviously no one was likely to believe them. Perhaps it was for the best if the Johnsons left after all. He was halfway through his speech when there was a heavy thudding and a clatter from the hallway. It sounded as if half an army had just broken down the front door and ridden to the hall. Zoe was about to go and investigate when the door burst open and Ziggy squelched in. He was soaking and clutching a long piece of rope that trailed out of the room. Several bits of seaweed flapped about the horns of his helmet. Ziggy! Cried Zoe, hugging him, even though he was wet. Ziggy, Ziggy! Tim yelled, climbing up his dripping leg. Yuck! He added, and quickly let go. It's the Vikings! Screamed all the children. How do? Good evening. It's a lovely yesterday, said Sigurd, beaming from ear to ear beneath his beard. I go row Hedby. I row and row, round and round. Boat go this way, boat go that way. Where am I? Only water, no land, can't see. I stand up, see better. No, one oar go way. What does he mean, one oar go way? Asked Mrs. Johnson. He lost an oar, said Mrs. Zoe quickly. Come on, Ziggy, then what happened? I row and row one oar. I go round and round in circle, only smaller I stand up again. Mrs. Ellis grinned. Don't tell me you lost the other oar. Sigurd shook his head and drops of sea water sprinkled from his beard. No, I keep oar, but fall in sea, splishy splashy. Climb in boat and but boat fall over, sloppy wopsy. Boat sink, I sink. Gurgle, gurgle. Good grief, who taught this idiot to speak? Moaned Mr. Ellis. I swim. I reach land. I come here. Sigurd stopped and grinned madly at everyone. Bring present. Present for Mr. Ellis and Mrs. Ellis. A present? Repeated Mr. Ellis weakly. To say thank you and how are you? Explained Ziggy. He hauled the rope in his hand. There was a strange clumping noise behind the door. Sigurd pulled harder and last brought into the room a large black and white cow. It stood there next to the settee like an alien from a distant planet, watching everyone with his vast, moony eyes. There he is, look. Fancy bringing a cow into a hotel living room. It's a bit strange. This for you, Sigurd said to Mr. Ellis. Present from Thor, god of thunder. We make offering. Ziggy pulled nosepicker from his scabbard. Tonight we kill cow. Say thank you for safe return. I not drown. One of the Johnson children was hiding behind her father. The youngest one was holding his nose and pulling at Mrs. Johnson's sleeve. Mummy, I think that cow has just done a... Yes, dear, interrupted Mrs. Johnson quickly. I know. Tonight we have feast, Sigurd went on. Lots to eat, yum. Mr. Ellis sighed heavily. A few minutes earlier he'd wished Sigurd was still with them. Now the Viking was back, and already he was wishing he'd gone down with the boat. Gurgle, gurgle. Zoe, please take Ziggy and that cow outside, he said. Explain why he can't sacrifice cows, and for goodness sake find out where they've come from. Take it back before the farmer slaps us all in jail. I shall try and sort things out here. Mr. Johnson had started to laugh. He got up from his chair and seized Mr. Ellis by the hand, pumping it warmly. I have an apology to make. I certainly do believe you. That Ziggy must be a real Viking. Couldn't be anything else. He's either a Viking or the biggest banana brain I've ever met. Anyhow, I think it's fantastic. Question is, have you got a room for my family? We'd love to stay with a real Viking, wouldn't we? Mrs. Johnson looked at the mess in the lounge floor. Only if the cow goes. Mr. Ellis hastily began to push the bemused cow backwards out of the room. Of course, no problem. This cow hasn't paid its bill for weeks anyway, he joked. Mrs. Tibblethwaite let a long sigh while Mr. Ellis and Zoe rushed off to fetch keys and prepare beds. She could see how busy they were, so she quickly set about cooking supper for everyone. By the time bedtime arrived, the Ellis family were exhausted. Mr. Ellis kissed his children good night. I have an apology to make too. I'm sorry I put Sigurd in that boat. Zoe hugged her father tightly. That's all right, Dad. He's come back to us now, hasn't he? He certainly has, said Mr. Ellis. By the time morning arrived, Mr. Ellis had done some serious thinking. He'd spent half the night discussing plans with his wife. They had a big new family staying at the hotel, and that meant a lot of extra work. This time they would really have to train Ziggy to do some of it. After that, said Mr. Ellis, it wasn't his fault that he put washing up in the washing machine. Maybe not. His wife smiled. We'll train him to be a waiter. We always need extra hands when it comes to dishing up food. Tim and Zoe will be back at school, so it won't be able to help you much longer. The big plans were put into operation. As soon as Sigurd appeared downstairs, everybody was already at breakfast, and Mr. Ellis had warned them that Sigurd was going to help. Please be patient. He has a lot to learn. The smallest Johnson child poked his father's leg. This is going to be fun, Daddy. Ziggy appeared with 2 plates of scrambled egg on toast. That's for Mr. and Mrs. Johnson, Mrs. Ellis said. Now watch me, Ziggy. Mr. Ellis carried a plate over to Mrs. Tibblethwaite and put it in front of her. Sigurd grinned and took his plates across to the Johnsons. He tipped the contents of the plates onto the placemats. Slop. Oh dear, murmured Mrs. Johnson. Ziggy, you have to leave it on the plates, explained Mr. Ellis. The Viking shook his hairy head. No make plops dirty. No want dirty plops. It's okay. It doesn't really matter if they're dirty. We always keep our food on plates, understand? Understand, said Ziggy, and he began to pick up the scrambled egg with his fingers and smear it black onto the plates. The smallest Johnson tithered. He's funny, he said. He's yucky, the oldest one said, and with some disgust. Sorry about this, Mr. Ellis said hastily. He pulled Sigurd to the corner of the room and started hissing instructions on him. Mrs. Tibblethwaite tapped Mr. Ellis on the shoulder. Let me do this. You get back to the kitchen. I'll soon have him under control. Mr. Ellis regretfully retired into the kitchen, while Mrs. Tibblethwaite slung a tea towel over the arm and grabbed the Viking with the other. Now watch me, she ordered, and Sigurd followed her like a lamb. Mr. and Mrs. Ellis and Tim and Zoe watched spellbound from the kitchen. You know, I do believe the old girl has quite enjoying herself, said Mr. Ellis. They make quite a good pair, don't they, Penny? She's a bit like a Viking warrior himself, his wife suggested. I'll be sad when she goes. She's been so helpful, more like one of the staff than a guest. Mr. Ellis smiled. Maybe everything's going to be all right after all. Perhaps Ziggy will bring us good luck. He's bought us a cow already, Tim pointed out. and Zoe started to laugh. Tomorrow's chapter is called Vanishing Act.